Morning rises over a newly free land with a brightness that feels almost unfamiliar. Sunlight spilling across hills that once carried smoke and gunfire, and a man stands still, listening to birds where orders once echoed, already sensing that freedom, when it finally arrives, does not ask what it has displaced. He's called a revolutionary now, a hero in speeches and songs, a mainstream historical transformation in post-independence Haiti, where fighters against colonial rule were rapidly recast as symbols, and historians still argue whether this elevation preserved dignity or erased private lives beneath collective memory. Before the war hardened him, before names were carved into banners, there was love, quiet, careful, born in stolen moments when secrecy was not romance but survival, because affection discovered by the wrong eyes could destroy more than hearts. She lived close to danger, moving messages, hiding supplies, existing between loyalties, and yes, this is one of those moments you probably won't survive easily, because love formed under threat rarely learns how to live once threat is gone. During the revolution, devotion is measured in risk rather than promise, and they learn to communicate through absence, trusting that silence means safety, a habit that will later prove impossible to unlearn. A quirky belief among fighters claims that thinking of a loved one before battle invites both courage and misfortune, and he carries her image anyway, folded carefully into resolve, believing memory itself can be a weapon against fear. Battles scatter them, units dissolve, plans fracture, and he tells himself separation is temporary, that liberation will restore what was interrupted, a hope shared widely by those who confuse political victory with personal repair. Mainstream accounts celebrate the revolution's unity, yet historians still argue how many private bonds were sacrificed to sustain momentum, because collective freedom often demands individual losses it never records. He survives, rises, adapts, learning the language of command, while she fades into uncertainty, last seen moving with others towards safety, a detail too small to survive official reports but too heavy to release from memory. As independence is declared, drums sound, crowds gather, and he joins them briefly, lifted by history's current, even as a quiet dread settles beneath the celebration. Because freedom has arrived without bringing back the one person he imagined standing beside him when it finally came. He waits for word in the days that follow, then weeks, telling himself patience is still discipline, though this waiting now feels different, stripped of urgency, heavy with the possibility that victory has already taken something it cannot return. A fringe account from later memoirs notes that many revolutionaries felt disoriented after peace, unsure where to place feelings once devoted to survival, and standing here, that disorientation feels personal, immediate, and unresolved. The land exhales after years of violence, but inside him, tension remains, because war taught him how to endure loss without confirmation, a lesson that freedom will not erase simply by existing. As the sun climbs higher, he turns away from the open view, aware that this new chapter has begun without closure, and that love, once aligned with struggle, has been left behind somewhere between gunfire and celebration. Before liberation rewrote the landscape, their love existed in fragments, assembled from brief encounters, shared warnings, and glances exchanged under the cover of necessity, because in occupied Saint-Domingue, intimacy survived only when it learned to move quietly. She was not officially recorded, not listed among officers or commanders, a mainstream historical reality for women whose contributions to the Haitian Revolution often passed through informal networks, and historians still argue how much resistance depended on such invisible labour. They met where messages were exchanged and supplies concealed, places chosen for usefulness rather than romance, yet usefulness did not prevent tenderness from forming. It merely forced tenderness to become efficient, compressed, and disciplined. A quirky belief circulated among fighters that lovers who spoke openly endangered each other twice, and so they learned restraint early, trusting silence more than promises, a habit that felt protective then and will later feel cruelly insufficient. He remembers her voice as low and steady, never rushed, a voice trained to deliver information without hesitation, and this steadiness becomes what he loves most, because in a world collapsing under violence, reliability feels like devotion. They never speak of the future directly, not marriage, not peace, because imagining life beyond survival feels indulgent. And indulgence is a liability when every day demands proof of loyalty through risk rather than words. Historians still argue whether revolutionary bonds were stronger for being forged under threat, but standing here, strength feels indistinguishable from fragility, because what survives danger is not always prepared for safety. Once she presses a folded note into his hand, nothing romantic, only instructions, yet the contact lingers longer than protocol allows, and that moment becomes a reference point he will return to repeatedly when memory begins searching for certainty. Violence intensifies, roots change, and they are separated not by argument, but by necessity, a common pattern during the later stages of the revolution when movement mattered more than reunion. He tells himself separation is strategy, not loss. Repeating this until repetition begins to sound like belief, because belief, even borrowed, steadies the mind when nothing else will. A fringe anecdote from oral histories suggests many fighters assumed those they loved would simply reappear after victory, as though survival guaranteed reunion, a hope that history proves unreliable with painful consistency. As months pass, he hears nothing, and silence, once comforting, begins to feel ambiguous, because when danger fades, silence loses its clarity and becomes something far more difficult to interpret honestly. He carries her absence into each skirmish, each decision telling himself he fights not only for freedom, but for the life they paused rather than abandoned, a distinction that matters deeply to him, even as it grows harder to defend. By the time independence draws near, love has become memory rather than presence, and memory, once it replaces reality, begins reshaping expectations in ways neither revolution nor victory can correct. War reshapes devotion by stretching it beyond recognition, and as campaigns intensify, he learns to measure loyalty in endurance rather than proximity, because closeness has become a liability in a landscape where survival depends on distance managed carefully. He rises in responsibility, commanding others, making decisions that cost lives, a mainstream historical trajectory for capable revolutionaries. And historians still argue whether leadership hardened compassion or merely redirected it toward abstraction rather than individuals. Each victory pulls him farther from the man she once knew, and he wonders, briefly and guiltily, whether she would still recognize him beneath the discipline now etched into his posture and voice. A quirky belief circulates among fighters that those who lead longest lose the ability to wait, and he feels this now, impatience replacing hope, because hope demands faith in return, while command demands resolution without confirmation. He asks discreetly about her whenever routes cross familiar villages, framing concern as logistics, though the answers arrive fragmented, contradictory, and ultimately useless, because war scatters truth as efficiently as it scatters people. Historians still argue how many women disappeared into the margins during the revolution's chaos, their fates absorbed into collective loss, and standing here that abstraction feels personal, sharp, and unresolved. He begins to fear that freedom will arrive carrying answers he does not want to hear, because uncertainty, though painful, still allows imagination to soften reality, while certainty often arrives without mercy. In rare, quiet moments, he recalls the exact weight of her presence beside him. Not romanticized, but practical, grounded, and this memory steadies him when ideology threatens to replace humanity entirely. Battles end abruptly, not with triumph but with exhaustion, and he realizes that devotion learned in emergency does not translate easily into peace, because peace offers time for questioned survival never permitted. A fringe detail from later oral tradition suggests many revolutionaries struggled to reconnect with loved ones after long campaigns, having learned to function without attachment, a cost rarely tallied alongside victory. As independence nears, he scans crowds unconsciously, searching faces without admitting it, because searching openly would acknowledge the possibility of loss he is not yet prepared to accept fully. He tells himself that freedom will correct everything, that order will restore what chaos scattered, a belief common among those who equate political resolution with emotional repair. Yet even as flags rise and battles cease, something in him remains braced, unable to release vigilance, because love suspended too long learns to survive as vigilance rather than trust. By the time the final fighting subsides, he understands that war has altered the shape of devotion itself, leaving him unsure whether what he waits for is reunion or permission to finally mourn. Independence arrives not as an ending, but as a sudden widening of space, banners lifted, proclamations read aloud, and he stands among others who celebrate loudly, aware that victory has removed urgency without restoring what urgency once protected from scrutiny. The new nation forms itself quickly, assigning roles, titles, responsibilities, a mainstream historical necessity in post-revolutionary Haiti, and historians still argue whether this speed preserved fragile unity or sacrificed reflection that might have softened personal loss. He searches openly now, no longer constrained by secrecy, asking names, tracing routes, visiting places once known to her, and this openness feels oddly vulnerable, because hope exposed to daylight is far more fragile than hope concealed by danger. A quirky belief circulates among survivors that those lost during war linger near sites of transition, markets, docks, crossroads, and he finds himself lingering there too, listening longer than necessary, as if absence might announce itself through sound. Each inquiry produces fragments. Someone recalls a woman like her, another remembers a message carried, a third insists she left with refugees toward the coast, and these contradictions exhaust him more than silence ever did. Historians still argue whether post-war chaos erased more lives than battle itself, but standing here, erasure feels active, relentless, as though peace has begun consuming what war merely displaced. He begins to realize that freedom has redistributed power but not certainty, and that institutions rising now have little patience for unresolved personal histories, preferring narratives that reinforce cohesion rather than complication. Rumors of her survival haunt him, arriving without proof, disappearing without closure, and he learns quickly that rumor is a cruel substitute for truth, offering just enough hope to prevent acceptance without ever providing relief. He delays decisions, postpones commitments, telling himself this is prudence, though in truth it is waiting reshaped again, no longer disciplined by danger but by reluctance to release what might still return. A fringe account from later memoirs notes that many leaders struggled privately after independence, carrying losses unsuited to celebration, and he recognizes himself in this pattern, smiling publicly while listening inwardly for a voice that never answers. The crowds thin, ceremonies conclude, and life resumes its rhythms, and he understands with quiet clarity that freedom has not restored his past. It has only made its absence visible, undeniable, and finally impossible to ignore without cost. As days turn into weeks, his searching becomes habit rather than mission, a ritual performed without expectation, because expectation, once disappointed too often, learns to disguise itself as duty. He senses that whatever comes next will not be reunion, but reckoning, and that love carried through war must now decide whether it can survive truth without the protection of uncertainty. By the time he stops asking aloud, he understands that victory has given him a nation, but taken away the last shelter where hope could pretend to wait indefinitely without choosing an ending. Power settles unevenly after revolution, and he feels it immediately, authority attaching itself to his name, his voice, his decisions, a mainstream historical consequence in early Haitian governance, where former fighters became leaders without the luxury of disentangling command from personal loss. Responsibilities multiply, councils form, expectations harden, and historians still argue whether leadership in the new nation allowed space for private grief. Though standing here, grief feels like an indulgence postponed indefinitely rather than processed or resolved. He accepts his role with discipline learned in war, telling himself service remains the highest loyalty, even as love recedes into something unspoken, carried privately where no one can mistake it for weakness or distraction. A quirky belief circulates among veterans that remembering the dead too openly invites instability, and he internalizes this logic, folding memory inward, because memory expressed aloud might invite questions he can no longer answer honestly. He hears her name once, or a name close enough to cause his breath to still, spoken casually in a market conversation, and this moment, brief and unverifiable, unsettles him more than certainty ever could. Historians still argue whether revolutionary leaders sacrificed intimacy to preserve authority, but from his position, sacrifice feels less chosen than inherited, passed along with responsibility as part of the cost of visibility. He begins to suspect that reunion, if it occurred, would not restore what was lost, because war and power have reshaped him, and she, if alive, would have been reshaped too, a recognition that feels both honest and devastating. Meetings stretch late, decisions weigh heavier, and he notices how often his thoughts drift backward during moments meant for progress, a quiet resistance to forward motion that feels like loyalty to something no longer present. A fringe note in oral histories suggests many leaders carried a private absence that tempered their authority, making them cautious, inward, and less trusting of triumph, and this description fits him uncomfortably well. By the time night falls, he understands that waiting has transformed again, no longer oriented towards return, but toward acceptance without proof, a posture that allows him to lead outwardly while carrying unresolved love inward without letting it surface. Years pass, and the nation settles into something resembling structure, though instability lingers beneath formality, and he feels time not as healing, but as accumulation, a mainstream historical rhythm for post-revolutionary leaders, whose private lives were postponed indefinitely in service of fragile order. He stops asking about her openly, not because curiosity has ended, but because inquiry now carries political weight, and historians still argue whether power silences grief or merely teaches it how to survive invisibly behind measured speech. A quirky belief among elders suggests that love lost during war remains bound to the land itself, and he experiences this often, sensing her presence not in faces, but in places, paths once travelled, clearings once shared, silence once protective. Occasionally, travellers bring stories of refugees settling elsewhere, names altered, lives rebuilt, and he listens carefully without interruption. Because listening is the only action that does not risk hope or despair outright. He learns discipline of a different kind now, the discipline of not imagining outcomes, because imagination once fueled survival, but now threatens stability, both personal and national, in ways he can no longer afford to indulge. Historians still argue whether revolutionary ideals survive leadership intact, and standing here, ideals feel worn thin by compromise, yet love, untested by governance, retains its sharpness precisely because it was never resolved. At night he dreams without images, only sensation, movement, urgency, unfinished sentences, and wakes with the familiar weight of absence pressing inward, a reminder that time does not erase what was never given permission to conclude. A fringe detail from later accounts suggests many leaders carried unresolved attachments as quiet restraint, shaping policies with caution born not of ideology, but of loss that made recklessness feel intolerable. He becomes known for moderation, for hesitation where others rush, and historians still debate whether this temperament reflects wisdom or hidden sorrow, though the answer matters less than the fact that absence has shaped his leadership as surely as conviction. By the time age touches his face noticeably, he understands that freedom did not fail him. Freedom simply did not promise reunion, and that love, carried beyond war, has survived only as memory disciplined into endurance without witness or reward. Memory settles differently with age, no longer sharp or urgent, but persistent, and he begins to understand how loss can become structure rather than wound, a mainstream historical pattern among revolutionary leaders whose private griefs were absorbed into public composure over decades of responsibility. He rarely speaks of the early days now, choosing language carefully when history is recounted, and historians still argue whether such restraint reflects wisdom or fatigue, though restraint itself has become second nature, practiced too long to abandon easily. A quirky belief among rural communities holds that names spoken less often grow heavier rather than lighter, and he feels this truth when her name surfaces in his thoughts, carrying weight precisely because it remains unspoken in public spaces. Visitors bring questions about ideals, unity, sacrifice, and he answers them with measured clarity, aware that ideals survive best when they are not burdened with unresolved personal longing that cannot be shared without destabilizing authority. Occasionally he imagines a life where she survived openly, where reunion occurred without consequence, and these imaginings feel less like hope and more like accounting, a quiet inventory of paths never taken rather than desires still pursued. Historians still argue whether personal loss tempered revolutionary fervour into governance, but standing here, moderation feels less ideological than experiential, shaped by knowing how much can be lost when certainty moves too quickly without regard for those left behind. He learns to accept that love does not always require presence to remain influential, and that memory, when carried carefully, can inform judgment without demanding satisfaction. A balance learned only through endurance rather than choice. A fringe observation from oral tradition notes that leaders who waited longest for personal closure often governed with the greatest caution, unwilling to gamble futures when their own pasts remained unsettled beneath composed exteriors. As years pass, his waiting loses urgency entirely, transforming into recognition rather than expectation, because expectation, once surrendered, frees energy for continuity rather than pursuit of what cannot be restored. By this stage of life, he no longer wonders where she is, but how love shaped under danger became discipline under peace, a transformation he accepts quietly, understanding that some bonds survive not through reunion, but through the way they alter how one lives thereafter. History does not record her name beside his, which is unsurprising in a nation built on survival first and memory second, because early Haitian records favour victories, leaders and declarations, and historians still argue whether this absence reflects chaos, intention, or the quiet cost of forging unity from ruin. He remains a figure of respect, cited in speeches, remembered for restraint and resolve, while a fringe belief among storytellers insists that the most disciplined leaders are often those who lost something they never recovered, carrying absence as instruction rather than grievance. She survives only in fragments, unnamed couriers, vanished women, rumours that drift without anchor, and yet her influence endures invisibly, shaping decisions, tempering ambition, and reminding him, silently, of the human cost beneath every political choice. They never reunite. Not because fate intervenes dramatically, but because war scattered lives beyond retrieval, and peace lacked the mechanisms to gather them again, a pattern historians still debate when measuring freedom's limits against its promises. Sometimes he wonders whether knowing her fate would have freed him, then recognises that certainty might have demanded a grief too large to carry, while building a nation still learning how not to fracture. Historians still argue whether unresolved loss weakens leaders or steadies them. But standing here at the end, steadiness feels earned, forged through restraint rather than closure, and shaped by love that was never allowed to finish its sentence. A quirky oral saying suggests that freedom reveals what cannot be restored, and this story fits that truth with quiet precision. Because liberation returned land, names and futures, but not the lives interrupted beyond recognition. In the end, nothing collapses publicly, no confession emerges, no reunion redeems the past, and yet love remains undeniable, because it shaped how freedom was carried, carefully, cautiously, and with an awareness of what victory can never fully return. The land settles into evening again, warm air drifting through trees that once hid footsteps and fear, and if you listen closely, you can almost hear how history keeps moving even when private stories stop asking to be resolved. Some loves are not meant to be recovered, they are meant to be carried. He walks through later years with a calm that others mistake for certainty, unaware that certainty is rarely born from answers, but from learning how to live without them. She remains unnamed, but not absent, present in the pauses he allows, the caution he practices, and the futures he refuses to gamble lightly. If you are listening now, let the tension ease. Let the waiting soften into understanding. Not every story ends in reunion, and not every loss requires explanation to remain meaningful. Some loves endure not by returning, but by shaping the way we hold freedom, responsibility, and one another. Breathe slowly. Let the night settle. Let memory rest where it belongs, not as ache but as quiet knowledge. End of script. Wishing you a wonderful day ahead. May everything unfold kindly for you.